Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us face tremendous uncertainty here in 2020 as we experience something known as a pandemic, certainly we can't imagine that as we began the year that we would be experiencing the kind of hardships that many of us are facing out there today. Just think about the fact that you're cruising along, you're feeling your dreams beginning to come true, and all of a sudden something comes along and just kind of hits you unexpectedly. Sort of much like the classic story of the Titanic. Here's this beautiful ocean liner considered to be unsinkable. Everybody's enjoying a wondrous, glorious journey across the Atlantic toward the United States from England. And one night, on a clear, beautiful night, it hits an iceberg and simply sinks. Well, on the program today, we're going to be joined with someone who experienced something, well, maybe not quite like that, but certainly it could be feeling as devastating. And this is someone who used to sit in a glass-walled office overlooking the trading floor in a Wall Street office. She was a winning portfolio manager of a flagship fund, and all of a sudden found herself that she just wasn't no longer on top of the world anymore. Going home every day, sunken with anxiety and depression, our guest was emotionally drained until she took time to examine her feelings and realize the dangerous mindset that had permeated her work as well as her culture. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today someone who is the author of the book Lifeboat, Navigating Unexpected Career Change and Disruption. Maggie Craddick joins us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Maggie, thank you for joining us today.
Well, Daniel, thanks so much for having me. That was quite an introduction.
Well, it's quite a time, isn't it? I could see that your book is going to be tremendously powerful for people here. Facing, when you look at all these shutdowns, people finding a business they started, especially if you're in the retail or restaurant industry, it's a good chance that many of them won't be opening back up again should we ever pull out of this. So tell us about how your story a little bit more, some detail, and what were you going through? What were you thinking when all this was happening to you?
Well, I really loved your introduction, and I'll say a couple of things about it. When I had one of my lifeboat moments, and there have been a few, right, because I do tell people that things happen that are just unexpected and cause all this disruption, and in those moments, we have some pretty important conversations with ourselves, right? So I was thinking about this when I was working on Wall Street, and I've got to tell you, Daniel, when I look back on my experience in those days, I really should have been on top of the world, particularly compared with some of the real job challenges people are facing today in terms of their entire, family business shutting down and being shuttered, right? But I can remember I had a great team. I was so proud of the way we worked together. We had won a couple of Lipper Awards for top National Fund performance. Michael Lipper had reached out to congratulate me personally. And I'm standing in a beautiful resort in Laguna Beach. I'm looking down at the waves, and I'm thinking, this is it. I should be tremendously happy. And I realized in that moment that something was missing, which seemed odd because, from an external point of view, I kind of had what I thought I wanted. But what was gnawing at me in those days, Daniel, was, is this really the highest and best use of my skills? Because the one thing I was always doing was I was rushing out there being who other people wanted me to be. I'd go on the trading floor, I'd be who they needed me to be. I'd reach out to boards of directors, I'd be who they needed me to be. It was sort of like morphing all the time. And that's all very well and good, unless you're giving away pieces of your authentic self as you do it, and you're never really off stage. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that instead of helping people make lucrative investment decisions, I wanted to help them create meaningful lives, right? And then another iteration of this came around because I went into executive coaching at that point, started writing books, and then I had just come off an assignment with a law firm that had shut its doors and just laid everyone off abruptly. One of the senior partners of the law firm called me up and he said, Maggie, I want you to come help coach the people who have been reporting to me because I can afford to retire, but they can't. And these people are just in shock. They think about their next career move. They can barely think about how they're going to get through the day. So this is going to take more than some, intellectual tips about how to network and spell checking a resume. This is going to take some real internal work so that these people are able to summon the courage they need to keep going and enter a competitive job market and work together to support each other. So I work with about 30 people. We went through some of the things that actually we touch on in the Lifeboat process. But after I finished that assignment, my father had passed away. So I went home to clean out my childhood bedroom, and there was this book on the Titanic. And when I picked it up and I looked at the human dimension of the questions that those Titanic survivors went through, the way that their entire sense of self evolved from being on the big ship to those lifeboats, and they had to face questions like, how long is this thing going to last? How bad is it going to get? Who can I trust? How will going through this change me? When I looked at those questions, I realized at a gut level that those questions and the fear and urgency with which they strike are timeless. And that's precisely what a lot of people are going through, I think, in the workforce today.
Well, too, and I got to say this as I started reading your book, and I'm going to look forward to sitting down and really relishing it, was that you actually open up in your very first chapter about the story of the Titanic. And as a result, I ended up saying, hey, honey, what do you say we watch the Titanic? And this was actually earlier this week, so we actually finished the movie last night. And I thought about the idealism these people must have been experiencing, and it's such a fascinating story. And I think what makes it fascinating is Titanic is truly a character of the story. I mean, it is the character of the whole thing. And you realize the idealism behind all this. Everybody just, especially, the upper levels that were on this journey, this exciting journey here. And, going toward America from England, many of them were foreigners. They weren't just all American. Going on this journey, and for something like this to happen, to realize, time seems to be just going on perfectly for me, just like earlier this year for a lot of people. And the next thing you know, bam, everything's getting shut down. We're all confused. Now we're hearing all this crazy stuff. It's an election year. They're losing their businesses, their livelihoods. People are actually possibly losing homes. There's so much going on for so many people. I can't imagine that we've experienced anything like this. This must have been almost like what it was like just during or just before the Great Depression. And when you think of people like our audience approaching midlife, it throws a lot of confusion, uncertainty, and reflection. And wow, just the stuff just really comes up, doesn't it?
It does. And here's where I think your listeners may really benefit from thinking about the Titanic story in a fresh way. And that's because, as you can imagine, I've been on the websites, I've been to the museums, I've read a lot of books on it, I've seen all the movies. And one thing that I would really like your listeners to bear in mind is what we call the difference between the big ship mindset and the lifeboat mindset. We talk about it a lot in the book, and I think it's really relevant to people trying to figure out not just the decisions they make, but having confidence in their decision-making process in a period where there's so much uncertainty, right? Because when you think of the story of the Titanic, I think it's important to bear in mind that what took that ship down started before it ever left port, right? So we really want to look at all the cost-cutting and the minimizing of safety precautions and the it can never happen to me attitude, right, that took hold of the people who built that ship and took off on its maiden voyage. And you mentioned, Daniel, that the Titanic itself is a character, and absolutely larger than life. That ship is steaming through the waters of the Atlantic Ocean more quickly than it needed to, right? Because this was about being larger than life. So when you think about the big ship mindset, I would say to your readers, this has nothing to do with the size of an organization you're working in. What it really has to do is a mindset that's rooted in old norms and what's worked in the past, right? And taking those old norms and stretching them to their optimistic limit. And as we see all around us, that isn't necessarily working out. And the behavior that takes place in our communities, our workplaces, sometimes even in our families, that stems from those old norms are things like what we saw in the Titanic. Everybody's supposed to remember their role, play their part, minimize uncomfortable feelings, ignore red flags that can never happen to us, stay busy all the time, faster's better. And you know when you're moving too quickly. Really check in with your feelings and notice red flags. You're moving a little too fast. And the lifeboat mentality really goes to making a huge shift. So just picture, if you will, what it would be like to be on that ship, heralded as unsinkable, and then suddenly, before you know it, you're huddled in a tiny watercraft being, buffeted around by these big waves in the waters of the Atlantic with people you don't know. And that's really that felt sense of what it's like to be very scared, as many of us are, and in a situation where we genuinely have more questions than answers. And so the heart of the lifeboat mindset and the way that we take these lessons and these transformations that took place among these lifeboat survivors and compare them to all the case studies that we work through about how people manage real-life challenges in their lives and their careers today, you want to think about being present with people at a very human level, not a transactional level, really human level, noticing how they look, how they sound, what's going on. Learning to take what we talk about as a strategic pause so that you aren't suppressing your feelings or ignoring them or denying them. You're really in touch with where you feel anxious, maybe angry, maybe a little resentful, but you don't let those feelings capsize you. You keep coming back to the present because the object is not to think your way through the situation. The object is to align your thoughts, your feelings, so you can tap into that emotional wisdom and experience we've all got, and your intentions, your genuine goals in the moment, so that you can make one practical positive step at a time that will keep you moving forward, so that as more information is presented and we make our way through this crisis, you're prepared and you're aligned with positive opportunities when they present themselves.
Now, you really made a shift, too, in your career as well as your life as you began to be more of a, I guess, personal coach, if you will. You work with Fortune 500 CEOs, senior management, and the like. You've done a lot of media tours. You've done a lot of articles, things like that. What would you find are common things that seem for people that when uncertainty comes up, that seems to be a consistent message or even a question they deal with right off the bat?
Well, I think when uncertainty strikes, one of the first things that people need to understand is the way that they operate when it's business as usual is not necessarily the way that they're going to operate under extreme pressure. And by that I mean let's think about how people think, Daniel. Under normal conditions, most of us like to think we're pretty objective and hopefully kind of strategic. But under extreme pressure, even very intellectually gifted people can be so flooded with adrenaline that they don't have access to the normal logic and brilliance that they've got under normal circumstances. They can become prone to polarized thinking, right? Snap judgments, black and white thinking. We're seeing triggers like this all over the place in our society, right? Feelings, emotions. Under normal conditions, most of us can handle a little bit of stress or can be a little bit upset or impatient with someone, and we can keep the game face on and stay focused, and it really doesn't rock us. But when you've got this much emotional pressure and triggers on all these different levels, those triggers can come up, and they can hit people so hard. Many people are really shocked by how much the fear of financial uncertainty is hitting them. And it really doesn't have anything to do with greed. It doesn't even have anything to do with keeping up with the Joneses in some cases. It hits them at a gut level and can keep them up at night because it's about having a sense of security in an insecure world, right? So we really need to learn how to manage the way that our thoughts and feelings work together, how that impacts the way we evaluate other people. If you're a senior business person, you want to make sure that you're giving people the benefit of the doubt. You're looking for their strengths. You're not prematurely making snap judgments, and it really has to go with this inner alignment that's so critical under pressure so that when we're hitting these triggers, and senior executives deal with this all the time, we've aligned our thoughts and our feelings and our actions in the present. I get calls from executives that will say things like, Maggie, I can't believe what just happened. That wasn't me. Maybe it was their big shot as a thought leader to speak truth to power, and when something got around to them in a board meeting, they opened their mouth and nothing came out. Or maybe it's someone that just got so impatient on a team meeting that they literally just hung up on the webinar, and now everybody's wondering what they're doing, and they're trying to, recenter so that they can appear to be patient and present and move forward, but they're so frustrated, right? The point of the matter is they're like, this isn't me. This isn't my self-image of who I am. My point to them is always, well, yes, it is you, and this is a lifeboat learning moment. So let's see where that conversation with yourself broke down. Or as we talk about in the book Lifeboat, Daniel, let's look at that inner iceberg of yours, because on the tip of the surface you notice things that annoy you a little, but underneath that you may hit a giant iceberg of frozen feelings that can throw you off, and before you know it, the way you're reacting, even to family members when they interrupt you, can be an unwelcome surprise, right? And when people go through these shifts in mindset that we talk about, that we can learn these timeless lessons from these Titanic survivors, they find themselves more aware of the roots of feelings they may have trained themselves to suppress, more able to take these strategic pauses. And then I've got the same people calling me saying, hey, I can't believe this. We had a really tense meeting with a client, and somebody said something that was just so sort of a slight hint of humor, but really brought everybody back to the present and created this tone of unity. We all had a laugh we really needed, and it took me 2 beats to realize I was the one who said it. So people, just like these people dug into their inner strengths under pressure, when you learn that inner alignment, you discover hidden strengths within yourself you didn't even know you had. And that's particularly critical right now, because many people are going to have to take a fresh look at their skills, Daniel, a fresh look at what they've done, where they can apply it a different way within their industry, whether or not they need to make a transition, and they are definitely going to have to dig deep in those conversations with themselves to stay motivated and to stay balanced, because the challenges in this situation just keep on coming.
There's no doubt about that. I remember as we were doing the program, I think it was about 10 years ago, and for some reason we got into a series of talks that all of a sudden it was more about neuroscience. And finally it was occurring to me, because I was somebody who, I remember back in the 80s, just picked up a self-help book because I was in an undesirable situation. I didn't feel happy going to work every day. You're not in a good spot when you're looking at the time clock and you're having daydreams about wrapping your hand in a cloth and punching it off the wall and just walking out.
Whoa.
Knowing that you're feeling stuck, though, and you don't know what to do. And when I picked up a self-help book and I started on that journey, it was just like a whole new world opened up to me, that I didn't have to live this way anymore.
Right.
But anyway, back to the neurosciences. Now, you got to imagine you're reading, you're just devouring the stuff. And I know a lot of people, as they get into crisis, especially the first time, they may head to that section in the bookstore. And the thing is, they'll pick it up, they'll read it, they're excited, they put it down, and they may take a step or two, and that's about as far as they go. And this is for a lot of people. And so here I am in this realm of interviews years later, and I began to understand, this is why I think people maybe, I don't like to call it failure, but why they don't understand how come it's 1 or 2 at best, maybe 5 steps. They quit and they find their lives in the same situation over and over again. As we talk about the iceberg, it's an amazing thing to realize the tip of the iceberg is just that, but the tremendous amount of the body of the iceberg is what you don't see, hence the subconscious mind. And as what we're talking about here is, we will find triggers, especially in crisis, that come up, and we find ourselves reacting. And that's the thing to pay attention to. And I know one of the biggest things that you like to talk about, and I believe this is true, because as you begin to pay attention to your thinking and circumstances, especially if you feel you're in crisis, like a lot of people are feeling today, the power of pause can be an amazing thing. Why don't we discuss what that is?
Well, and I'm so glad we're really going to dig into this, because even when you're talking about, your hand in the closet, that's yet another way to distract yourself from what you'd prefer not to know. The power of the pause is really critical. A lot of us talk about the importance of taking this strategic pause. So here's the thing. In your body, you can feel the tension rising. You're getting upset, you're distracted, you're so bored it's painful, okay? Whatever's going on, right, you're feeling something. Now, if you sort of try to split your consciousness, so you're like, I really shouldn't be feeling this, do you know what I mean? Then there you are. You're in limbo. You've got that internal tension going on between what's really happening with you and the fact that you prefer not to know it in that moment, okay? And it's one way of treading water. But the point of the matter is, right now, we're in a historic period where if people actually learn this simple skill, it will give them the emotional agility they need to excel at almost anything. Their marriage, dealing with their elderly parents, getting promoted within their industry, picking a great investment advisor and making clear decisions, it will really give them confidence in their decision-making process. But the thing about the strategic pause, and why we talk about it as the gateway to so much in part of this book, is that most people will imagine themselves pausing. They'll agree with us on this conversation, Daniel, and say, I really should learn how to take that strategic pause. But they won't really do it. And like many of important skills that we talk about in the lifeboat process, you learn it by doing it. You can't learn to ride a bike or play tennis by discussing it or reading about it. You got to get out there and try. You've got to get out there and develop the muscle memory. This is emotional muscle memory. The first time or first few times people try a strategic pause under pressure, they often fail. They'll call me and they'll say, Maggie, I tried, and I had to rush out of the meeting. I knew I was going to lose my temper. Or, I did it again, Maggie. I filled in an uncomfortable silence with all this anxious chatter because I want people to like me so much. I just couldn't keep it more succinct and senatorial. Whatever your style is around it when your fear trigger hits. But if you learn to take these strategic pauses, you realize that it's almost like photographic stills. You face the feeling, and you don't waste a lot of energy trying to judge yourself for it. You just accept it, okay? I'm scared. I'm angry. I'm resentful. Maybe I even feel a little petty. Whatever it is, here it is. This is my life path. Let's just, take a chill pill. This is what I'm feeling, okay? Now back to the present. How am I going to deal with it? What people want to get to are the roots of things that are often tied to norms in their family system. Things like, don't make a lot of noise. Just go along to get along, or lean into conflict and don't ever let anybody, show you up. Whatever's going on with it, we have these emotional triggers. You're talking about neuroscience. Sometimes they're nature, sometimes they're nurture, but there's usually some core patterns in there that impact all of us. When you identify these uncomfortable feelings, you can start to get a handle on what they are, then you can take those pauses and retrain yourself. And when you do this, there's so many examples in the book of people who almost had to leave their job because the emotional dynamics going on were so difficult. People being bullied, people being passed over for promotion. We talk about all of it in the book, and you see these examples about how people, instead of giving their power away, they learn the strategic pause, they clarify the conversations they're having with themselves and what they're genuinely feeling. And then when somebody takes a shot at them in a meeting, rather than taking the bait, they can align their thoughts and their feelings and what they need to do in that role at that moment. And without even getting into an argument, they are able to negotiate conflict with so much integrity that they literally raise the vibration of the entire room. Things end up working out. And this is very vital, not just in the conversations we have with other people, which can be drastically improved by learning this skill. But most important at a time like this, Daniel, it boils down to the conversations we're having with ourselves. Where do I want to work? Do I want to stay in this job? Is being in this environment something that's enhancing my self-esteem, making it possible for me to believe in myself, modeling norms of respect and support for other people? Or is this just bringing in so much chaotic energy that I can't even focus on my family right now, right? How's that rolling? It's not, when you're evaluating your career, it's not just the financial solvency of your workplace right now, the emotional energy and the values of your workplace and whether or not you're aligned with those.
Now, it's very key for people to understand, first of all, is they may think about this book as, well, this sounds like one of them books that are about careers and jobs and learning to assess yourself. Don't be deceived by that, because really you could read this book as I have, as I began to, and realize that this is an important work because it does exactly what we're talking about. It helps you to see clearly what's happening, to learn how to assess and experience what's happening, how to transcend that, and to develop, as you like to say, a more authentic person that you are. And it's pretty amazing because one of the things that you talk about in the very beginning of the book is, for instance, who do I trust in a crisis when I'm having one of those? And a lot of times what I believe all of us do is this, is that when we face a crisis, perhaps you've lost a job or you're in a career that's become so unsatisfying, but yet you feel stuck. There's a tremendous amount of pain. It could be that you're going to the store and you get into a car crash. Whatever it is that causes you pain, especially emotional pain, most of the time you reach out for someone who will sympathize with you, take on your pain, and hopefully tell you, don't worry about it, it's all going to feel better, and then you'll go through that line of questioning just so you can soothe the pain, when in fact the opportunity arises there for you to transcend this by paying attention to how am I feeling, how am I talking to myself about the situation that I'm in now. Like a good example is, as I've mentioned in the pandemic, just imagine the people that are out there, they're in their 40s, their 50s, or 60s, and perhaps they realize, I'm about to lose a business, and they begin to sit and question as they're in deep uncertainty. Why did I make the kind of decisions that I made that's led me to here right now? I thought it was all supposed to be good when I rolled up my sleeves. I chased my dreams. I did it with courage and guts, and this is what I get out of all of it. How would you approach somebody like that?
Well, I will say two things to this. I think it's two steps, and I think it's a wonderful question and a wonderful thing to talk about. I mean, not a wonderful thing, but an important thing to address.
And wonderful, too. Because I think about when I go way back to my self-help book reading days, it was, I can't remember the name of the book. I think it was by Og Mandino. If I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not, but he's kind of a legend in the self-help field. But always shall I seek the seed of success in every adversity, or something like that. So you're looking for what is the gift in the adversity that I'm in. And I suppose that's kind of the direction I'm thinking of here.
We really do want to embrace the lesson at the heart of any challenge. I will say, too, that what the Lifeboat process is about also is building on the shoulders of a lot of great self-help writers. You know, I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote all the stages of On Death and Dying.
She's been on, very familiar with her work, and it's funny how misunderstood that is. People think that's a linear process, but it's really not. She just says, no, this is just everything everybody experiences.
Some of the iceberg work to those stages. But to your question, for your listeners right now, we're trying to make the move and build on the shoulders of giants. We're trying to make the move in our thinking from the self-help mindset to what I call the us-help mindset, okay? And that's because there are some things that you simply can't do alone. You need the support of other people. For instance, you can't row a lifeboat through the icy waters of the Atlantic by yourself. You simply can't, right? You've got to be able to balance your personal goals and your individual security with some way of collaborating with others to achieve the greater good, particularly in critical conditions, right? So we talked before about the strategic pause and the inner iceberg, but there's so many things we go through in this book that really help people, just like the scenario you're laying out. Somebody started a business, they played by the rules, and the whole thing just looks like a mess right now, and how did this happen, right? But we help people align in the present moment and accept exactly what's going on. There are examples in the Lifeboat, everything from comparing Robert Hitchens, who broke down on Lifeboat number 6, to Margaret Brown, who united the entire boat, both in the midst of losing everything in life and death circumstances, and we go through all the internal stages they go through to find that unifying internal strength and create that wave of positive energy that not only gets them through, but brings other people along with them. But another thing we talk about in the book is something I call lifeboat feedback. And I think it's absolutely critical when we think of the self-help mindset and how we do want personal growth, but the us-help mindset and the role other people play in helping us sustain that sense of balance and continue through a difficult period when it just seems going on and on. So, as a coach, I've talked to people about lots of different kinds of feedback, performance feedback, communication feedback, you name it. But lifeboat feedback is very special, and it involves finding someone in your life that you trust. If you're really fortunate and you married your best friend like I did, this could very well be your spouse. But it could be a close friend. It could be a former college roommate. It could be someone from a professional networking organization. It could be someone from your community. But find someone you trust who will be emotionally honest with you and tell you what they genuinely think as opposed to what they think you want to hear, okay? And then when you're facing some of these big decisions, like I'm not quite sure how I'm going to put all this in perspective, you don't ask them what to do. You ask for feedback on your thought process and whether you sound like you're being true to yourself under pressure. You explore questions like, do I sound like I'm being emotionally honest with myself as I assess this, or are there some feelings that I can't even admit to myself or I'm trying to suppress? Or do you think I'm being clear with myself about my motives? Or do you think my assessment of this or a difficult situation is fair? And if not, why not? Because one of the things we explore in the lifeboat process is how many of us, under pressure, will create a narrative where we cast ourselves as the victim. And it gives us permission to give up or finger point or distract ourselves or possibly even indulge in dysfunctional or addictive behavior under pressure because we just can't quite bear present and accept our feelings in the moment and accept the situation as well. And when we stop creating those narratives and we get present at a very human level, it is amazing the solutions we discover and the power we find within ourselves. On lifeboat number 6, Margaret Brown realized what all these people needed, and when they thought they were dead in the water, she came up with the idea of organizing people 2 to an oar, and it saved their lives. When we're looking at our business, if you can get out of the narratives that are so tempting to create because they may rescue that idealized image you had of your plan or yourself that's so hard to face the disillusion of, you can get rid of that narrative and get in the present. You may see opportunities to reform your business that can be quite lucrative. Somebody told me one the other day about the people that invented Play-Doh. They literally had some kind of substance that they couldn't sell anymore, and they found a way of repackaging it. There are things we can do. Everyone has innate skills about, sales, conflict mediation, understanding customers, things that they need, but they need to be able to think about what their key skills are, what they've learned up to this point, how they can apply them transitionally, or if it's time to do something really new. And sometimes it isn't even time to jump on a lifeboat. Sometimes it's time to hang on. You get a handle on that self-created narrative, you can sometimes respond to what used to be an emotionally challenging situation in a far more resilient way.
I can't help but as I remember as I was reading in your book, Lifeboat, is that your favorite, I guess, part of the story of the Titanic was as it struck the iceberg, and that of Captain Smith. And it was pretty amazing as I was reading that because I was also sitting there thinking about today's current events, especially in the political spectrum. And you think about our current president, Donald Trump. And I'm looking at this guy here, and there are some people that say, I can't stand that guy, and others that love him. But the bottom line is when you think about what this guy does every day, here was a guy that decided to leave what he was doing as a billionaire, hotel developer, you name it. Besides, he loves this country so much, he's going to run for president. He really doesn't expect to win, but I'm sure that he hopes, and he sure gave it his all. Seemed like he was having a good time, especially during the debates. Then he spends the next 3.5+ years getting beat up over some nonsense. Now he's facing this pandemic. Everybody's criticizing how well he's either doing or he's not doing. trying to reach out and help the American people. Then you look at his geopolitical position, and one of the consistent things that I hear out there when you really pay attention is people say, where does this guy get up every single day with the kind of energy that he does to do a job where he knows he has to face the kind of uncertainty that he faces? And, again, like I said, you can love him or you can hate him, but he's somebody to look to say, well, if somebody can do it, maybe so can I with where I'm at, chasing the direction that I want to go. What would you say about that?
I would say that when you look at how polarized the climate in our country is right now, and you think about how hard it is to be president of the United States, I'm with you. Getting out of bed in the morning and finding the energy to keep at it has got to be a heroic thing to do in so many ways. But one thing I always stress in the lifeboat process is we really have to understand. I think that this is important for all of us, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on politically. And Daniel, our children are on both sides of the aisle. We've got some children that are supporters of Trump, and we've got some children that are leaning another way in their political decisions, right? So we really just encourage everybody to be as authentic as they need to be in their decision-making process. This entire environment really invites something that I think is central to the lifeboat process, and that is when you think about why people follow any specific leader, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Different people will be drawn to different types of leaders for different reasons. And often their decision-making process will have an emotional component to it. Something moves them, something stirs them in terms of their values. People may say, well, how does Trump do it? How does he press on in the face of all this criticism? Other people who come from a different life path may have a different set of parameters around this. Look at all of the incredible enthusiasm for diversity in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That comes from a very different set of parameters and a different life path. But whatever way you're doing it, if you want to make a really informed decision that's going to support your community, that's going to support your family, and potentially that's going to support your job in a very polarized environment, it's important to remember that you need to stay aligned with your thoughts, your feelings, and your intentions in the present moment. And because there's so many different power styles going along, when you're delivering a message, you need to bear in mind not just what you want to convey, but how other people feel about themselves in your presence. And we talk about this a lot in Lifeboat. So after people have listened to you deliver a message and they walk away, how do they feel about themselves? Do they feel supported, encouraged, or do they feel, somewhat diminished or like they've been emotionally erased? I think that's something we all have to think about, not just the political leaders out there that are trying to hang on to office or run for office as we go into, I think, a very historic presidential election, but also all of us as we're talking with our families and friends. We make our points about what really inspires us, what we really admire, and then as we make them, we have to make them in such a way that someone else can hear it, and there's room for them to have a conversation with themselves around it that invites them to be open-minded, as opposed to almost making it a foregone conclusion that they're going to be defensive because we phrased our point in a way that would cause just about any reasonable person to shut down.
Well, that's absolutely true, I'll tell you, and it's crazy because I was just recently finishing a book by one Jordan Belfort, which many people know of as the Wolf of Wall Street. And what he was talking about in his book, he says, I came to the realization that all sales are the same. And when he goes in to describe how that is, he says it doesn't matter what it is when you're selling. He says it's all the same process. And that process is to build certainty into the person you're selling to. Doesn't matter whether you're on a job interview or you're selling products or services, maybe books, for instance, like Lifeboat. And you think about today's climate, and we're all trying to find that in ourselves, especially when it comes to the environment that we're all experiencing now worldwide. You have a pandemic, then after that, the next thing you know, we have an unfortunate death that we all agree was tragic, that we all agree needed to have a voice out there. Then you have protests, which makes sense, but now they turn into riots, and now it's turned into, well, it looks like we're having our country invaded and we'll never see America again. I mean, if there's ever a time in my lifetime I've faced uncertainty, I mean, this is probably the biggest test for everybody.
Well, but here's the thing I think is really important for everybody to bear in mind, and this is kind of central to the lifeboat process, because, again, remember what it feels like to be in that small boat, right, surrounded by people that you don't know fighting for your life, people from very different walks of life, right? And so while the commonality of any sale, not to, having been on Wall Street myself, I humbly address the point of the Wolf of Wall Street, who I'm sure I'm Red Riding Hood by comparison, right? But yes, the commonality is there, but some people feel that commonality because you establish it based on how much you validate people and come up with really important warm, fuzzy values about home and community and caring and courtesy, and you want to know about their kids and you want to know about their personal life. Some people you establish that commonality because they want to know that you're slick and fast and deal maker and you can think faster than anybody else on your feet and you're going to make it happen, right? Some people establish that commonality because you are this patriarchal archetype of tradition. And in your presence, they feel almost a timeless sense of respect for authority. And in some people, you're going to establish that commonality because from the spiritual point of view, you're charismatic and you speak to their better angels. So how you establish that sense of commonality is something that you really have to be present for and note the human nuances of, particularly in a relatively polarizing time. And sometimes those nuances aren't even verbal. Sometimes you see them in body language and tone and pacing. We go into all of this in Lifeboat because particularly when we're working remotely, we're trying to convey a message through social media and we're not actually there with people together. Even as we go into the Republican and Democratic conventions and we may not be able to be present for those, right? We're going to be taking them in through audio-visual medium, potentially, right? You've got to understand that you reach people different ways. Even Donald Trump, I would assume, would be agile enough to shift his delivery in different circumstances, depending upon his audience, right? So I realize his style is relatively consistent, but I would think that if he is addressing a group of suburban women, his style may shift a little bit than it is when he's addressing the commanders of the military, right? So
sure.
It's all really understanding, right, that it's not just the point you're making. It's how after that point has been delivered, the people who have been in your presence take that, and your point becomes part of a conversation they're having with themselves under pressure. Because where we start and stop in the lifeboat process is a lot of this is going to come down to the conversations we have with ourselves. The final question in the lifeboat process is, what will my story be? And we are in a historic period, and we know it, Daniel. So when people look back on their leadership, what will people say about their leadership legacy and the actions they took when they look back on this through the lens of history? What will you say to your family about how you handled your emotions and your thoughts and made strategic decisions at this turning point in your business, in your community, in any sort of endeavor that you're focused on right now? We have the opportunity to really do that work we need to do, to have clearer conversations with ourselves logically and emotionally. And we talk about exactly how you do that and you get to the roots of that inner iceberg. We have the ability to shift our relationships with others so that they're less transactional, and we really learn the emotional agility required to establish rapport with a wide range of people. Because, again, it's not one size fits all in terms of what motivates people. If it were, we wouldn't be as polarized as we are, right?
Isn't that true?
Finally, this us help thing, right? It's vital that we stay clear with our own feelings and values and what we believe in, and we put our energy and our intentions around supporting groups and causes that truly align with our authentic values, because then no matter what happens, we know that we've given it our best effort.
It's also true, and I'm wondering, Maggie, is when you were finding yourself getting off the sinking ship, so to speak, into a lifeboat, what were the big reveals for you that you went to yourself, I never thought about it that way before? I mean, what was that process for you like?
Well, and here's one area you just revealed something, Daniel, where the metaphor may not be perfect, and I'm glad you revealed it because my big ship wasn't really sinking at the time. Things were going, pretty well. So I did have the opportunity to do the financial planning, the careful financial planning I needed to do to be able to live for a couple of years and re-educate myself, right? So I went back and got my master's in social work and then went through the Ackerman Institute for Families and Couples Therapy to see about the group dynamics and how those impact the way that different individuals behave. And some of that, in a very light way, probably laces through some of the exercises that people will see in the lifeboat work. But what was really interesting for me is I had left a flagship Wall Street fund, and I had been one of those people in the crew who had a fancy title, and when I walked into a room, people would come up to me, introduce themselves, want to make conversation, not really based on me, based on the position that I held in an important organization and what my work in that role might do that would benefit their careers, right? And when I actually made the shift to go out on my own, that was not the case anymore. Now it's just me. And it was just me and my abilities and what I could bring to the party. And what was worse is that I was one of the first people to really bring a very feelings-based, psychologically minded lens into executive coaching. Back when I started doing this in the 1990s, the disciplines of, let's say, counseling and business consulting were very, very distinct. And blending those two things so that people understood how things like emotional agility and personal growth actually impacted executive performance weren't exactly easy circles to square in those days. Now, many people have subsequently, and there's some wonderful people in this space. But in the past, as you can imagine, people who were specialists in these distinct areas weren't exactly thrilled about those different specialties merging at times, right? That's the way things evolve. But over time, I managed to just keep doing what I was doing, stay humble, keep learning, and one client at a time start to measure the benefits of different types of approaches and how they can really help people do what we all need to do at turning points, which is take a clear look at our strengths, take a clear look at what we think we need additional support with, whether that's different training or the support of other individuals. We need to collaborate with them and figure out what's going to work in our environment. And those solutions are there for everybody who is listening. Because if there's one thing I've learned in over 20 years of coaching and writing, it's that there are no accidents. If people are listening, if people are looking for solutions, we need them. We need them. Nobody's here by accident. Nobody has the gifts they have by accident. And when people really discover what's authentic for them in terms of their professional efforts and their strengths in this world, not one single thing they've done will be wasted. Not a high school breakup, not 10 years of experience at a certain job, even if what you learned was what you don't want, not any of it. It all comes together, and we find out that everything that's happened to us is part of what we're meant to pull together to operate authentically. And that goes right back to the self-help book you were talking about earlier, where there's always a lesson at the heart of every challenge. And if we can take that strategic pause, look at that lesson clearly and accept it and evolve, we're on our way.
I know my wife. I consider her to be one of the most spiritual people that I've met. And she likes to talk a lot of times about how we're incarnated into a life to learn lessons for our own spiritual evolution. And so when you think about that, and whether you believe in that or not, it's totally up to you. And the thing is when you take a look at that and you realize, well, I jump on this and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I mean, the biggest thing now is people challenge, for instance, having to wear masks. Well, we already know that society is compliant. How is that? Well, because when you're born, you learn through your parents to comply, to do what they tell you to do for your own safety and well-being. Then you move from there into school, an education system, where you're there to please and you're there to comply to the rules, take tests so that you're successful. Then you take that same thing, maybe further education, then you go into a job, and you can see how we always comply. I mean, that's just our pattern in nature there. But then when something kicks you off to the side as you believe you were doing all the right things, you realize, well, wait a minute. You become very confused, and I say to those people, and I remember having this epiphany, if you will, and this was back probably in the early part of the 2000s. I was talking with an astrophysicist out of Harvard, and wrote this beautiful, or had this beautiful book called Magnificent Universe, and had all these fantastic images from the Hubble Space Telescope of things like galaxies and solar systems, things like that. And he says in his book, and this stood out for me the most in this wonderful, big, beautiful book, was the universe is chaos. And I remember somehow blending that into everything that I had learned. And for those who are out there, like us, as we've been talking about this year, things are cruising along just like, the beginning voyage of the Titanic. You're eating great meals. Everything's just beautiful. The future's just beautiful. And bam, something changes it. And what I say is this simply is true. That's the universe. That's what you live in. It's chaos. It will never stay stable that way. What stays stable, as you've clearly talked about here today, Maggie, is how are you able to adapt from it? How are you able to learn from it, grow from it, and share that with others as well? And that's the best stability I think any of us can really count on as we traverse this path and learn these spiritual lessons that I guess we're supposed to be learning, on our path to evolution. What would you say to something like that?
I'm so glad you brought up the spiritual dimension, and I'm so grateful that you feel that you're married to an extremely spiritual person, because I feel I am as well. I think my husband's one of the most spiritual, right? Which is just, isn't that a blessing in life?
And as I say to people, this isn't about religion. That's the practice of your spirituality. It's just what is spirit, especially when we think of this. And it's a pretty amazing thing to think about as you're in these times. So.
Well, one of my favorite writers is Saint Teresa of Avila, right? Who was just a Christian mystic who wrote some absolutely beautiful things. But when I think about spirituality, I think about forgiveness, okay? And one of the things we've got to bear in mind, and the Lifeboat process talks about it a lot, and when we were talking about strategic pauses, Daniel, remember I said give yourself permission not to do it perfectly?
Right.
Or give yourself permission to accept the fact that you feel angry, or you feel impatient, or you feel anxious, and forgive yourself and come back to the present moment. Well, I think that I really would like to speak to your listeners about something practical with this. Let's accept the fact that none of us are going to be able to handle this pandemic perfectly. Even if you wear a mask all the time in COVID, every single pencil you pick up and orange you bring home, okay? This is a very difficult situation. And I think we have to be really careful about those snap judgments of other people. Now, when it comes to masks, I'm an advocate of that, because scientists are saying around the world that it would be helpful, and I have to ask, what's it going to hurt? The only reason that I'm choosing not to wear one is for self-expression and ego and style points. I don't even think people in the Trump administration would come down on you for wearing one. You know what I mean?
Right.
One is only trying to care about the community. But on the other hand, when you're around friends, when you're around family, all these things, there are moments when this gets really tricky, because you don't want people to feel like you don't accept them or don't validate how careful they've been, or you want to see them smile or something like this. We have to be vigilant at a time like this, but we have to proceed gently at the same time and realize as we navigate our businesses, navigate our lives, there are no perfect solutions here. We need to keep centered in the present moment. We need not to drag ourselves or other people down with undue harsh judgments, and we need to keep doing our best. And the most important thing we can do to restore a sense of unity, I think, in our world right now. Stop judging ourselves so harshly. Is the key to giving other people the benefit of the doubt under pressure when you just can't understand what they're thinking or why they're doing what they're doing. Train yourself to be gentle with yourself. So when you're sitting there, whether you're reading a book like Lifeboat or looking at a video on your computer or anything like this, or you find that someone comes in and interrupts you when you've lost an important document, or God forbid you've lost an important client, right? Do you snap, or are you gentle and thoughtful in that moment? That's a really close indicator of how you deal with yourself under pressure. Are you kind to yourself, or is there some kind of sharp voice barking orders in your head when you don't get it right? One of the big lessons here is real power, real resilience. It comes from being thoughtful and kind toward ourselves. When we establish that tone in our inner world, tends to be something that permeates and like tuning forks, actually lifts the tone of people in our outer world as well.
And with that, I completely agree with you, because your inner world reflects to the outer world the reality you believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And physics has proven this over and over and over again. And I think it's so true that, I had this guest earlier this year before all this started. And we're cruising along, and I'm trying to remember what her name is. It just can't come to mind now. But she said something that I went, wow, I would have never thought about that. But she was talking about a lot of chaos that she's seen coming. But basically the bottom line is that we're all going to be seeing things as they really are now. I mean, all of our stuff is going to come up. She didn't know really what it was, but she could just see this. But she says the profound thing when you think about it is this is the year 2020. And when she said that, that had a huge impact on me, unlike I've experienced in a long time from anyone. And I thought, wow, the lenses are clear. Let's take a look at who we are. And the reality is, as you step back and look at the big picture of all this is, I think we've come to a point that we've surrendered our personal power to a degree. We expect our government to solve our problems. We expect everyone else to understand and take responsibility for our problems. And nobody wants to take any responsibility, for why they are, where they are, experiencing what they are. And clearly, I believe what we've talked about here today is the quicker that you could take personal 100% responsibility for everything going on around you in your world, and you can begin to start doing that insight as we're talking about here, the world's going to be a better place around you, even in light of all this chaos.
Well, that's so right, and that is exactly what I've tried to do, standing on the shoulders of giants, of course, and my favorite authors that have come before me, but the lifeboat process that's laid out in this book is precisely what you were just talking about. We on that big ship, with that Titanic thinking, we expect the leaders of our companies, the leaders of our nations, the leaders of our communities to have the answer for us, right? To get us through this voyage.
And it's their fault if they don't. Like I said, boy, I feel for Donald Trump. How does that guy get up every day and face the things he faces every day? It's pretty amazing, whether you like him or not. Wow.
You can blame Trump for a lot of things, but you can't blame him for a global pandemic. You really can't. We're struggling with it around the world, right? But the point of the matter is, for all of us, where we are in our world today, it's important that we remember that there are these turning points in history that, regardless of any leader's intentions, we really need to take responsibility for how we're going to navigate our own lifeboats through these rough waters when we have more questions than answers. They do too. And the lifeboat process is a very thoughtful, gentle process, simple actions that people can take that can enhance their emotional resilience and their confidence in their own decision-making process. Does it answer all the big questions? No, that's not the point. It helps people reconnect with their genuine sense of self in such a way that they listen to themselves more clearly, and it helps them get through this period without getting too far off course.
And simply revert back to the story, too. Can you consider yourself to potentially become the unsinkable Molly Brown?
What I love about her, people are always saying, Maggie, why Molly Brown? Before I did the book that came before this one, I wrote a book for Harvard Business Press called Power Genes and all these different power styles. And I got to work with military leaders who, their power style was about command, and their favorite books and leaders were all about, military campaigns and great celebrated military figures from history. And I got to work with spiritual leaders who were so charismatic and wonderful, and they would recommend books from the teachers that came before them. And I got to work with top Wall Street traders and financiers that would, give me books written by their mentors and say, this is the thing. And the reason that I really love Margaret Brown from the story of the Titanic is this is a woman thrown onto lifeboat number 6. She did not want any kind of naval command or commendation. She was a gracefully aging grandmother that only got on that boat to get to the bedside of her sick grandson. Stopped in the middle of this situation, and she's surrounded by all these people that had come from that big ship with very distinct, polarizing power styles that pitted them against one another. She had women in first class that were so upset if everything didn't go smoothly, and Daniel thinks we're not going smoothly, right?
No, they weren't.
Military commanders that were all up in arms about who was in charge. She had people from steerage that were freezing because they didn't have enough clothes, and all the people from first class had come in this thing in first. There was a power struggle breaking out. Nobody knew what to do, and the woman sat and looked and listened. And, my husband's a sailor. I think another reason I chose the story of the Titanic is because Charles and I have spent time on the water, and we spent time on the water in bad weather. That can be really scary, particularly when you're out in the ocean in a small watercraft. So here they are, surrounded by icebergs. I mean, this is scary stuff, right? And in the middle of all this, she uses those charismatic skills to really calm the women from first class down and get them communicating with the people in steerage and give the people in steerage something warmer to wear because most of the people in first class had come with their furs on them and really get them aligned to an oar. And then when Robert Hitchens gets all upset about who has formal command and tries to stop her from getting people to work together to stay warm and get through the night, this woman suddenly stands up and summons this wave of authoritative courage that I'm pretty sure she didn't even know she had. Because remember, women, particularly civilians, were not necessarily used to dressing down military officers in those days, right? She stands up on that ship and she tells him that if he does not stand aside and allow them to row, they're going to throw him overboard. And everyone on that boat, including the 2 other guys, get behind her. And by the time they're rescued, they have renamed her Lady Margaret and called her really the force that saved them all. But what I love about it, she didn't think her way to the solution, Daniel. Had that inner alignment. And I think what's so important for all of us to remember, and the difference between the big ship mindset and the lifeboat mindset is, what gets you through a situation when you're facing the unknown, not your thought process. We're also tempted to think that we have the right idea because it gives us an illusion of control. It simplifies things for us. Really facing the unknown, and you know this from a spiritual perspective, you really need that alignment. You really need to be in touch with what you're feeling, right? Your sense of what matters. Let your thoughts work with that, but not be eclipsed by it, that inner alignment. Because you can't think your way through
Here, here, definitely. The book is Lifeboat, Navigating Unexpected Career Change and Disruption. And I do say this adamantly, this isn't just about career change. This is about changing your life entirely and how you engage in it to be present for it. And Maggie, first of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be on the program here and navigate us through these rough waters. And how can people navigate to a place where they can find this book and find out more about your work and get in touch?
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's such a pleasure having this conversation with you. My website is workplacerelationships, that's plural.com. You can find me under Maggie Craddick on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. You can find me at Maggie Craddick on Twitter. And you can find Lifeboat, Navigating Unexpected Career Change and Disruption on Amazon. Barnes & Noble, just about any place that you would look with a major bookseller, you'll find it.
Very good. So I suppose the looming question for everyone out there is, now that we've hit the iceberg, how do we find ourselves to the shore, and who will we be once we arrive?
Absolutely.
Fascinating times, definitely. Maggie, thank you for being back here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. You can also navigate with your steerage over to beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanks for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.